Alrighty, hello every folks, and welcome to a beginner's guide to Chapter 4. Alright, so it's an exciting and confusing time. You've made it to the final, kinda sorta, chapter of the game, and, well, level cap's at 50, you're stuck at 32, and, well, you don't know what exactly to do from here. Well, that's fine. That's what we're here to discuss today. So first and foremost, pay attention to this map. We will be discussing this particular path in a moment, but Farumpa Wildwood is a bit of an important part, but we'll get back to this. Okay, so first of all, now that you're in this chapter, what should you be aware of, and kind of what things should you keep an eye out for? First, at the very start of Chapter 4, just so you're aware, technically speaking, there is a semi-hidden character that you can get, as well as a unique class that will be available for Denim Canopus Vice if he survived up to this point, and the new guy, Azelston. But they are intentionally meant as a bit of a pain in the neck to get a hold of. Just so you're aware, there's basically a ton of little side quests throughout the final chapter. Basically, it's a conclusion of a whole bunch of different things, but there's a whole bunch of little side quests in here that are, in many cases, meant to be completed on a repeat playthrough. Basically, once you complete Chapter 4, you're allowed to world back. It's called the world system. It's basically, it's just you go back in time to another point in your decisions and just branch them off. It's a whole long discussion all of its own, but point being, you can come back and do stuff differently. But what you should pay attention to is the fact that at the very start, you will essentially see a news thing right over here that will tell you, hey, you know, there's some stuff going on. Namely, if we read about about Port Omish down here. Now, while I generally would not recommend bothering to go through the full thing to pick up this unique class and this guy on a first playthrough, what I will say is that it's worth going and doing, at the very least, the start of his little side quest there. At the very least, running into Port Omish. The reason for this is that after you do, you will then unlock the Pirate's Graveyard, which is this right here, and that's going to be the second available kind of dungeon area here, as it were. Your first one's in Farumpa. That one is, and remains to this point, a place where you can, you know, recruit monster units, recruit some classes a bit earlier into the game, like, for example, ninjas and swordmasters and dragoons can be found early there. You can find things like cyclopes and your cockatrices and griffins and all of that kind of business. But this is your second one that's available, and that's for recruiting things like liches or let's say more types of zombie units. As was covered in a previous video, you can basically recruit zombie versions if you have the matching racial skills, like zombie beasts are still just beasts. Technically speaking, you can also get some of those in here, but you get way more of them here, and there's generic liches that you can get a hold of. Additionally, this is a good place to acquire some lizards if you don't have any on your team as of yet. This is when you'd get your kind of bulkier classes and things like that, and this is usually when you'd see a lot more lizard classes becoming available. So lizard men are typically far more durable than your normal people units, and they will have access to things like a Patriarch, which are going to be a really, really good spellcaster class, arguably one of the best, if not the best. So you have access to both Patriarchs and Liches in the Pirate's Graveyard pretty much immediately into Chapter 4. Now, if you're looking for a sort of top-tier caster-type unit, I would recommend picking up at least one of either of those. Basically, Patriarchs are your first kind of more dedicated caster unit that can still use melee equipment, so like they can use heavy armor, they can use things like poisoned daggers, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and also still have access to good ranged abilities and the ability to basically ignore certain types of damage every now and then. Long story short, fantastic class. Definitely worth going out of your way to just kind of see the kinds of things you can recruit in the Pirate's Graveyard. Whether or not you decide to pursue Azelston is entirely up to you, but his whole side quest, again, just to be very clear, was designed in a way in which you would repeatedly get frustrated at seeing him die off at certain points, and so you would go back in time and get him once you have the ability. This is why typically when it comes to guides to recruit the guy, it seems needlessly complicated. It's because it was designed that way. Okay, so next up, let's go ahead and talk about a few things that can change throughout the chapter. Usually it's only to do with that guy's side quest, but there are technically a few different sections to this chapter. So at this point, this is kind of the second half of the chapter, but really we haven't unlocked very much yet. Omish is really the only kind of missable thing up to this point. And if you wanted to do the whole Azelston side quest, again, this is kind of a whole story of its own. You more or less have to constantly go and check your Warren report for new stories, in which he'll basically tell you where the guy's at any given point. So, for example, like right here, he was saved that first time, and then he went and disappeared. But we visited the pirate's graveyard, and so we find out that a dread pirate exists. They tried to do a whole mystery thing with that. Again, it's kind of meant that way on purpose, but at this point it can potentially expand two different ways. If you read about the blast on Exeter, you'll be able to go to the top left of the map, and then you can also read about your own goings-on in the story. So, the blast on Exeter will open up these 5 maps right here. So this is the Palace of the Dead kind of sort of side quest thing. I would not recommend pursuing this yet. Technically speaking, you can go into here, you can do all 100 floors of the Palace of the Dead if you'd like. Basically, this is an endgame dungeon with a bunch of kind of interesting equipment, and basically is going to have some of the best equipment in the game. Basically, the way that it breaks down is that floors 1 through 25 will give you a lot of kind of general purpose stuff, so like flight rings, flight shoes, warping rings, just various kinds of small upgrades to your equipment, as well as stuff like the Crescent, which can then be upgraded into the Cupid bow, which is basically a guaranteed charm weapon for your archers, and that is hilarious for creating automatic teams. But for now, I would recommend just waiting on this. Again, you can technically do it. Your own personal level caps out at 40 for the purposes of Palace of the Dead. You will be scaled down at all times. But for the moment, it's not the levels. I will point out that generally speaking, levels are kind of held up in a bit higher of a regard than they need to be. Right now, it's not the levels that are the issue, but the fact that we have not currently unlocked the entirety of the Palace of the Dead shop yet. You see, there's one more shop upgrade for the game to do, and if you go in at this point, they won't have access to the summon abilities, which, as far as casters go, are generally speaking going to be some of your stronger hitting moves, so you don't want to go in there just yet. You can basically just make it easier and get more out of it later. So for now, what you want to do is go ahead and proceed to do the kind of northern invasion bit. Again, we're assuming that you're not bothering to go for Azelston right now. Just save that for New Game Plus. Don't bother right now. Okay, moving on. Okay, so let's talk about other stuff that you can kind of do at this point. So once you complete the northern invasion, you will then reach a sort of big branching point where you can suddenly do a lot of things very quickly here. So we get to about here. We end up going back in this direction. We end up getting a cutscene depending on how you handle that whole situation. And then we end up looking back and seeing, okay, all of this stuff is open. However, if we go into the Warren report, as we should be kind of getting in a habit of doing by this point, we'll see that a bunch of new stuff happens. So, like, for example, on this particular load, I hadn't looked at Palace of the Dead yet, but we then see this right here. So, the Ramsden Wreck was raised. This is going to be the first option that we get to go and open up this area of the map. So, this will be the first of several expansions that the map does in order to give you kind of a bunch more side quest content here. And we're going to be talking about getting the most out of all of this stuff. So if you really want to just speedrun expanding your strategic options very quickly, read about the Ramsden Wreck, go do your random battle here at the Lufa coast, and then take a boat over to Grimsby. This will then unlock Fusiliers and give you the ability to craft Fusils. Additionally, this will also end up giving you Lyndall, who is basically just a slightly faster Fusilier, and he'll come with his Fusils pretty much already just about maxed out here. And additionally, then if we go into the stories again, you'll see that there's another story that says that the fortresses are under siege, which will then open up all of the fortress maps across the map here. So Geld Fortress over here, you got the Gecko Fortress over here, you got the Bode Fortress over here, you got Kadriga down here, as well as Nadamsa over here, and Lizan over here, and all of them will suddenly have a bunch of pirate fights on there. So you just want to go in and clear those out. Yes, technically there's some additional drops you can get off of finishing off all the units on there, but generally speaking, you might as well just go snipe the leaders and call it a day. They are, for the most part, relatively low health units, so if you want to, just equip units with high weapon skills and shots, as well as lobber, so both Beast Tamers and Fusiliers will work for this, and you can just basically nuke the leaders, ignore their defense, and call it good. It's an expensive but quick way to just kind of speedrun all of those maps. Now, if we go back into the Warren Report yet again, we'll find out that there's several more news stories that ended up coming out as this went on. Namely, the Ancient Temples, the Apocrypha, as well as, by this point, you probably also have seen the Bandits of Nimrahava, or however you pronounce that. So, if we look at that, the Nimrahava wood over there, if you go into there, you'll recruit Gamp and his Griffins after a bit of a large fight. It's kind of a large, swampy map. And then if we were to go ahead and go over to Karitanai, we'll then have a conversation with Maruvra. So he's the Pope guy. I know he's not technically a Pope, but whatever, close enough. He's the head of the local church there. And his whole thing is basically, hey guys, so we got elemental nukes. That's just a thing we have. Don't question it. And well, he wants to know if you're good enough to go ahead and use all of that stuff. Well, here that actually should be, or no, I guess it's not that one right there. Are they going to be in here? So you'll have this little conversation with the guy, and he'll ask you if you're ready to go take on the responsibility of these nukes. If you tell him no, you basically closed off the side quest, and there's no reason to select that option. I believe you get a slight bump in Chaos Frame, but honestly, unless that's something you very specifically want, you're more or less just closing off that content for the time being. But if you select yes, he'll tell you that you need to get at least one of his daughters, which by this point you should have at least Olivia in your team, and they will then open up the temples for you. So once again, the temple maps will become red. This will allow you to go in and have a series of 4 fights in those locations. Some things to particularly keep in mind, by the way, is that every one of them will have a type theme to them. They are all elemental temples. So, for example, if we look over at the Gecko Fortress, there's going to be a lot of things that have the option to petrify you in there, because it is the Earth Fortress. Additionally, stuff like the Bode Fortress will, I believe that was the one that had a whole bunch of Cyclopes in there, which can mass stun your units. Just expect a lot of weird, tricky nonsense, and definitely bring ways to deal with debuffs. Of particular note, though, is that almost all of them will have a couple of necromancers somewhere along the way. So if you wanted to recruit some generic necromancers, that's an option. And additionally, over in Kadriga, there are some hydras that spawn alongside the boss in the 4th fight here. If you're looking to recruit Deneb later on down the line, make sure to pick up at least one of those, but they are pretty good units otherwise. Alright, so once you've gone and completed any of them, you will start noticing that you are getting a lot of crafting books. And a lot of them will be full of stuff that you can't technically quite make yet, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So, for example, things like having access to being able to upgrade many of your Damask pieces of gear, as well as I believe this is around the point where you end up getting things like the Dragon Fang, which will end up giving you access to a few more options for your weapons. Armor-wise, you'll start noticing that you'll have things like these robes available. You'll end up finding these a bit like this. So you'll find the Blade, Axe, Spear, Hammer, Codex of Jewelry 4, Armorcraft, Bow, Fusel, Enchiridion, Shieldcraft, Fist, Cudgel, Crossbow, Katana, and a few others available in the temples. You'll basically get 3 every time that you go through and complete one of them. I don't remember the exact ones, but in all honesty, you really should just complete all of them at least once in order to get access to the Apocrypha abilities, which are those elemental nukes from before. Basically, they're some of the hardest hitting direct elemental AoE abilities in the game, and then you're also gaining access to a bunch of crafted equipment. Now, this is going to give you more options to play around with. Please bear in mind that this isn't going to be some crazy overpowered gear for the most part, but it does give you more options to play around with. So, for example, something like the crafted Dragon Fang over here has the ability to poison on hit, making it very handy for something like a Patriarch here, where if they run out of MP, they can run up and attempt to poison something with their knife. So there's a lot of little strategic options that end up opening up out of those books. So bear in mind that some of them will have some unexpected bonuses on there. Like I said, some have debuff effects. If you look at the elemental bows, for example, you'll notice that they actually are one-handed and come with a counterattack effect, meaning that you can, for example, have a counter-attacking dagger build or something along those lines. So just kind of bear that in mind as a bit of an option. And additionally then, you'll start noticing that yes, a lot of these things are going to be difficult for you to craft for the moment. This is fine. You don't need this stuff to proceed. In fact, you really don't need any of this stuff to really beat the game, but it is going to make a lot of things dramatically easier. Alright, so around this point, we should go ahead and complete everything up until the Hanging Garden. So this is the final gauntlet of the game, and at this point you should be, at the very least, at level 36. So, at this point, this is when we should start considering this kind of northwestern push over here. So you'll have a series of different fights. So over here you have Majora Drift. This is another opportunity to pick up a Hydra. So you can pick up one from there if you want to, again, recruit Deneb later. But bear in mind, recruiting her requires an exceptional amount of money, which, if you're not using the money exploit, it's going to take a very long time to build up that much money. If you are using the infinite money exploit, you probably already have at least the 1.5 million it takes to recruit her. But then you have a few random fights going all the way through here, and once you get to Lausanne, you'll notice that if you're on the law route, if you have managed to get through Yunan's kind of redemption side quest in the background, if you were doing this your first time through, you probably didn't. But if your reputation is good enough, and if you've managed to get that redemption side quest done, at this point, Oshone will join you over here. She is basically a unique dragon tamer that will come with a pet dragon. So that's all well and nice. Additionally, if you've made sure that Ozma has lived up to this point, and also have Hobram in your team, then over in Crisaro, you'll be able to go and recruit her. Basically, you just have to kill Volak, get her to low health, and she will surrender. But again, Hobram has to identify himself to his wife. She is not 100% sure it's him, and unless he confirms it, she will just attack you. Anyway, so at this point, we have now cleared the temples, we've gotten a whole pile of crafting books, we've unlocked some new units, and at this point we can proceed to Palace of the Dead. But before we proceed in there, remember earlier I was showing you that map in Farampa Wildwood. Well, basically the reason for this is right here. So I will say I technically had a better setup for this particular save file, and then the game crashed, and I didn't really feel like redoing it again, so here we are. Technically speaking, you can have these guys at level 36, and you should probably pick up a team of about 10 of them. You can do 12 if, you're already here, you might as well, but you have access to Rune Fencers, Knights, Terror Knights, as well as Enchantresses and Wizards, as well as Archers too. So if you've done everything kind of up to this point, you then have your kind of most convenient way to automatically handle Palace of the Dead. So the thing is, most units by this point will start getting access to Steadfast. If they were at 36, they would already have access to it, but generally speaking, yes. If you go to this map right here, you can very reliably just go in here, and if we go and scout right here, you'll see that there are Hawkman and humanoid zombies that will spawn very regularly. You won't be able to change their class, but if you hire them as they are, they'll basically be able to infinitely regenerate themselves instead of having to worry about spending money on things like Blessing Stones. And additionally, there's only one type of unit in the entirety of Palace of the Dead that has the ability to exercise. Alright, and that would be these guys right here. So, the Necromancers. Basically, this right here, Banish, is the only thing that can possibly threaten a zombie unit in Palace of the Dead, for the most part. We'll cover exceptions in just a sec. But basically, the Clerics don't seem to ever bring Exorcism with them. Few units, if any, will carry a Staff of Purification. and generally speaking, you'll find that zombies will be a nice way to just kind of automatically grind your way through that thing. But why would you want to do it automatically? It's, you know, there's a lot of challenging maps in there. And yes, true, you can do it manually, but just so you know, the kind of way that I'd recommend doing it, first of all, is on your first route. You just kind of charge in there, and you basically go in with your A team. You cover the story fights. You cover as much as you want to cover, and basically just know that certain maps, namely I believe it's, I want to say 13, 16, and 50 something, will have unique kind of story events. You fight a boss there once, and then after that the place is basically cleared out. So the reason that you'd want to do this is to then go back and collect all of the various piles of loot in the place. Because setting up an automatic team to be able to completely just kind of mass farm random stuff in there is going to give you a pretty massive advantage as far as stuff goes on. However, it's oftentimes difficult to do so, and so I wanted to set up an easy way to allow anyone to do this, because by the time you get into the kind of a post-game situation here, a lot of this stuff becomes kind of not quite necessary, but very handy to have on hand. And you don't want to be doing those same maps over and over. So again, my recommendation is to take your A team for your first time through, see the types of units that you're running into, see the elements that you're running into, and that's how you're going to tailor your kind of zombie team there to deal with all of them. What I would recommend is typically something along the lines of at least 2 Terror Knights with Lament of the Dead. Terrifying Impact if you feel like it, but basically Lament of the Dead is fast and cheap, so it's definitely worth having on there. At least a couple of Knights. They don't really need healing support, but with something like Ease, it can be pretty handy. Having a Rune Fencer in particular is going to be very handy there. Again, just spears. Scorpion +1 is definitely worth having. Now, personally, when I was going and testing this out, again, unfortunately it kind of crashed, but 2 Terror Knights, 4 Scorpion +1 Rune Fencers were pretty much ideal for that whole situation, just because they regularly spread out so much poison. Every time the zombies would get knocked out, they would just simply come back to life. Bear in mind, they will not use anything along the lines of buffs, so like Boon of Swiftness or whatever else, so don't really bother with that stuff. But Lament of the Dead will basically passively cause all of them to get debuffed. The Scorpion will passively cause all of them to get inflicted with poison, meaning that heavy units are basically a non-issue. There's a lot of heavy units in Palace of the Dead. A lot of them will directly attack your front line, and if you're counter-poisoning them, they're going to do some pretty solid stuff. On top of this, I would recommend getting at least 2 warrior units on that team with vigorous attack. This will guarantee the poison effect on those spears. And additionally, I would recommend at least 2 archers of different elements. Ideally, something along the lines of either light or potentially ice. Now, there's a slight quirk to this. In order to get that light archer, you got to do some other shenanigans. Namely, you have to zombify a cleric, which requires going through Palace of the Dead in the first place, or at the very least reaching the Palace of the Dead shop. So for example, if you were to take a cleric, turn them into an archer, while having that divine element, they would remain divine, you zombify them, then suddenly you have a archer that's super effective against a whole lot of things in Palace of the Dead. Why archers, though? I thought they were supposed to be considered a low-power unit, and it depends. See, I know I go on about them a lot, but ranged weapons will scale dramatically higher than anything else, meaning that as far as anti-squishy duty, as well as taking advantage of any weaknesses, so for example, if there's units that are hit by fear or by breach, it's definitely worth considering. Now, if you already have the option to zombify something, a Volge +1 on a Dragoon is once again just going to be optimal, just allowing for a unit to be breached, which again allows for those kind of backline archers there to clean up as needed. So between all of these guys, you more or less have an immortal team that, for the most part, cannot die. Now, you may notice that there's a lot of death pits in Palace of the Dead. The thing about that is that you can more or less make those go away. So if you noticed, many of those frontliners are going to be units that have Steadfast. They gain access to Steadfast by the time you unlock level 36 there, which is one of those reasons that you want to wait until that point in order to go into this place. Because Steadfast means that under no circumstances can they be moved backwards at all. It doesn't matter if it's a shield bash, doesn't matter if it's a crit, they are rooted to whatever tile they picked. So, as a result, they will not be able to be knocked into death pits. You might have heard that using flight or warp rings will bring you back up to your feet, and yes, 100% you should use those on your archers or other backline units, but for everybody else, Steadfast will always be better. The reason for this, at least for auto-grinding teams, just to be 100% clear, the reason for this is because if they get knocked out, they will still die if they fall into a death pit. They essentially, the resolution for that fall happens immediately. You don't get the option to simply come back from that fall and then pass out. They're already passed out when they fell into the hole, they're already dead. Bear in mind, in some cases, also, if they're hit by something like leaden, it may not give them the option to come back if they don't have the vertical clearance to make that happen. And in some cases, some other debuffs can cause them to simply lose the ability to move as well. So, overall, while they do sort out most situations, units can still die while using those pieces of equipment. Now, again, the point of this is to mostly have a disposable army, but just so you're aware, that's a bit of a quirk of the system there. So, why, getting back to the previous point, why on earth are we even bothering to do all of this stuff here? I thought that, I thought this was, like, if we're only doing floors 1 to 25, why does it matter that much? Well, because you can get a lot of very useful equipment. If you're going to Hanging Gardens, you're going to want the ability to fly because there's a lot of very vertical maps. Once again, it's not necessary, but it will help dramatically in a lot of situations. And you get a lot of flight items that will spawn on those first 25 floors. Additionally, it will also give you a lot of crafting books. Basically, most of the remaining crafting books in the game will spawn on these first 25 floors. They're scattered about all over the place, and it's typically going to be a lot more effective to just kind of randomly cluster bomb this place and collect whatever's left, rather than trying to go for specific drops. Yes, there are a lot of drop tables, yes, there's a lot of very specific drops, but if you can find a way to, again, just carpet bomb the entire place and just pick through the remains, it's going to be a lot faster and give you a lot more things to play around with. You may notice that even here in the post-game, you are still capped out at 40. You're not losing anything by going in here at 36. It's basically going to be the same thing going in here after the game and before it. There's maybe a couple of items that will make a difference, but realistically speaking, you can go in here just as effectively at 36 as you can at 40. So I mentioned earlier there's a bit of a kind of overemphasis on how good some items may be. Or rather, some levels and things may be, and the reason for this is because it's only about 2 to 3 points per level that you're getting. Comparatively speaking, everyone's stats are going to be running anywhere from 2 to 300 in this kind of endgame section here, meaning that you're really only getting a few percent bonus between those big level jumps. Your big level jumps are in the unlocks, and the unlocks are pretty much going to be about as good at 36 as they are at 40, so this is really when you should be proceeding forward. There are, again, some exceptions. Things like Nature's Power become available for Shamans and Valkyries, which definitely will help them out. Well, actually, Liches as well. But generally speaking, if you're looking to go for this lowest common denominator team here, you will generally have an easier time just doing it at 36. I guess less easier, more it's honestly just as good to do it at this point. Okay. So, what kind of, again, we already talked about it, you already get a lot of crafting books, you get a lot of new kind of elemental weapons, elemental armors and things. Why do those help you? Well, they allow you to split your coverage in many cases. So if you pick up elemental weapons, you may notice your units up to this point have been doing effective damage versus the thing that they're strong against. But you have two options here. You can basically min-max somebody, where you go and you use their same element weapon on their own element, and they will be about 10% stronger when using it. However, you can also use them to split their coverage in different directions. So for example, if somebody is weak to, like let's say they're a water unit, they're weak to lightning, you equip them with some earth armor that will allow them to resist that lightning better. They can cover their own weaknesses and then also use different types of different weapons to cover their own weaknesses when it comes to attacking things. They will basically get a 30% bonus and kind of sort of switch an element when they're using an elemental weapon of a type that isn't their own. More or less, it just gives you the means to be more effective in more situations, or they can min-max at being better at what they already do. That option's entirely up to you, but our point in this guide here is basically just to cover the kinds of expansion that you can do up to this point. Okay, so if you got to this point and you forgot to go pick up those zombies from earlier, another thing to consider is that you can retreat at any time. So if you already completed the second map here, there's actually a lot of humanoid zombies in here, and they all will come kind of scaled up to your particular level. So if we were to look here, we got some wizards, we got some archers, we got more casters over here. Well, I'm not seeing any frontliners in this immediate team. That is also something to consider. You can just hire your own zombies while you're down here in Palace of the Dead. So once you have enough of those, first 25 floors, you'll, generally speaking, be pretty well decked out to just go do Hanging Gardens at that point. You could, technically speaking, continue on as far as you'd like through Palace of the Dead, acquire all kinds of relics and things, and at that point, I mean, in many cases, you'll start becoming fairly excessively powerful when it comes to your units. Just bear in mind, this is also going to make the final fight a little bit harder for Hanging Gardens, just kind of FYI. But either darn ways, just so you know, the options are there. Alright, a couple of other little considerations here. Past about level 50 or so, generally speaking, I would not recommend doing I wouldn't recommend completing all of Palace of the Dead when you're in kind of the pre-post game kind of section. Just before you complete the game, there's just a lot of things that you haven't quite gotten access to yet, and really it's just going to be more difficult than you might potentially be expecting. So maybe just kind of back out at that point. But what other things can you potentially accomplish if you really feel like min-maxing? Well, we mentioned earlier that there's that Azelston side quest. If you were to go for that, you get access to the Buccaneer, which basically allows for Denim Canopus, Vice, and the new guy to have access to stuff like Evade. If you wanted to go recruit Deneb at this point, basically you need to recruit one of each dragon type, as well as a Hydra. I know it's technically a dragon type, but either way. You sell one of each of them to her shop, buy 3 of each orb. Actually, I believe it's maybe 1 at this point. Either way, you spend a egregious amount of money in her shop to go pick up a bunch of, elemental rocket launchers, more or less. And she will then offer to join you. If you additionally have used 3 of these relic items from Palace of the Dead, or if you manage to spawn them some other way, basically 3 upgrades in her shop will cause her to join in her unique class. It's not really worth necessarily going out of your way for, but just so you're aware, it is a thing. So, as far as relic items, there's a lot of different flavors, but basically it's anything here that has this kind of reddish background to it. You can combine 2 of them to give you better values over here. If they're purple, they're maxed out. If they're white, they're not. And that's really about that as far as that goes. Once you do 3 upgrades in her shop, she has the ability to automatically give herself Spell Strike and Spellcraft, as well as equip whips. That's more or less what the Witch is all about. And her side quest is kind of funny and potentially allows you to recruit a unique pumpkin, so that's also fun. Alright, other little kind of considerations for this point. Let's see. If you happen to have been on neutral, and you wanted to still recruit the last of the sisters here, you actually still have that option available to you. So if you're early on into Chapter 4, you've just beaten the Sherry fight, but she ran away, you can go into Bel Mimosa on a rainy day. So, like for example, if you go into training mode, you use a Savage Horn, you make it rain there, and then you leave and come back. This can be a little bit finicky if it just decides to stop raining the same day, But generally speaking, if you go there during the rainy season, you'll just kind of run into her, and she'll end up joining you. If, on the other hand, Saria has survived up to this point, but you haven't recruited her on your team, again, if you're on neutral, if you happen to go into the Bode Fortress, you'll find that she's just kind of hanging out there. Basically, she's there with her new pirate, or not even Bode Fortress. Where was it? I don't think I have it unlocked on this particular save file. But basically, once you go into the fort, they will be somewhere along the lines of down here somewhere. You go into there. I'm fairly certain it's in Bode. I could be misremembering, but point being, you go in there, you recruit her. There's an option to fight her instead. I don't really know why you do that, but it's there as an option. So her and her pirate friend will join you. Actually, I did withdraw out of there a little bit sooner than I should have. Technically, if you make it to map 3 there, up on the top left, there's a very obvious "Hi, I am totally not a hidden tile doorway" thing. If you step somebody on there, then you'll be able to explore the rest of the Palace of the Dead. Should have maybe highlighted that a little bit better, but hey, what if, what is one of these videos without a ton of mistakes? Okay. So, yeah, that's about that. Other things to note about Palace of the Dead. If you're having trouble, bring poison units, bring white knights, just generally go a bit slower. Don't try to rely on healing. Basically, defensive offense is pretty effective there. Having something with high mobility and a lot of revive items is not a terrible idea. So, for example, this was my typical loadout for a griffin that I kept on the team pretty much constantly. This might seem a little bit of an odd choice to have the grease string that you can get fairly early in there on a flying unit, but bear in mind many flyers technically are not allowed to step into water tiles, so this does give them that option. If you have anybody knocked out over a swamp tile, this might potentially allow them to be saved. Just one of those weird little things to consider. Let's see, what else? Yeah, if you do Deneb side quest, this guy is unique. Definitely consider getting him. Okay, if doing Palace of the Dead manually, don't underestimate any fairies or gremlins or anything like that. Generally speaking, have ranged units clean them up first. They definitely can cause your heavies to be more or less permanently stun-locked in some cases. Also, never underestimate the goodness of simply shield bashing stuff into cliffs. Generally speaking, losing, some potential loot is gonna be a decent bit more useful than just throwing a fight for no reason. So if you see a difficulty, just, again, don't be too afraid to just throw something off a cliff. Additionally, again, Steadfast, generally speaking, will be better than any other options when it comes to a unit that can use it there. Yes, you're giving up a skill slot for it, but it's going to be very, very worthwhile. Additionally, it's worth considering that you're going to be running through a lot of maps, so don't try to rely on constantly burning through, let's say MP regeneration items. You're just going to run out of them before anything else. If you're looking for a cheap alternative, as I've said before, Fruit of the Adept, you can make these pretty much infinitely for pretty darn cheap. But generally speaking, you want to try to kind of leave your clerics behind, not having them do the standard healing. Just kind of have them sit and constantly roll for meditate in order to get their MP up. Save them for things like big AoE heals, kind of big one-shot heals, and when it comes to your kind of Mother's Blessing type heals, and also resurrections. Any money that you can save going through it, if you're not using the infinite money exploit, are going to be very handy. Additionally, having things like if you go and you use a Cyclops, or especially if you end up zombifying a Cyclops, that's a pretty solid choice in there as well. They also get access to Steadfast, so they're going to be one of the better kind of units to have for that. Howl plus Steadfast on Cyclops, and you basically have an entire team stunned for free. If you don't end up saving this guy, don't really worry about it. He doesn't really have any other scenes outside of that first one, and he's basically just here as a March of the Black Queen reference, and a very, very loose one at that. Oh, by the way, another thing to possibly consider, until, like with those zombie archers, just so you know, if you wanted to have the ability to roll for stun on, or roll for charm on everybody, but didn't have access to a Cupid bow yet, if you go over to your finishers, you can actually deselect them and turn off every other finisher. So just so you're aware, you can cause them to spam one finisher over and over. And if for example, you want to have something like defensive Valkyries or Rune Fencers with a poison effect on there, rather than relying on the Scorpion +1 and Vigorous combo, you can always have them run swords and put on Vile Wound in order to give everybody the ability to automatically poison. Again, we're just kind of going for dumb AI builds in that particular case. But yeah, if you wanted them to spam one finisher over and over, you absolutely can just tell them to do that. And another consideration to bear in mind for your AI teams is going to be something like this right here. So if you wanted to, let's say, have a ninja on there, it actually is not a terrible idea to run something like this. Again, if you can zombify them, all the better. But basically, either a silencing bow or a short bow +1 here. Honestly, the AI is pretty ineffective with their turns anyway, so either one of these is gonna be just fine. But basically the idea is that you can have them spam multiple debuffs at once. So for example, in this case, the way that we have this set up is that we have Benumb followed by Envenom. Basically it'll check skills from left to right when it comes to automatics. So in this particular case, he has a chance to silence. He's already using a ranged weapon, so he's probably going to be targeting squishier things like casters, but he will ideally roll Envenom to just poison something, but also has the chance to roll Benumb in case that doesn't roll. So kind of gives him some backup stuff there. You know, Smoke Bomb for making stuff miss more often, Steel Stance for making himself survive more often. Just again, another one of those things to kind of consider whenever building your teams for all that stuff. Again, I'm just assuming most folks are going to be eventually switching to an AI team, so I figured I'd throw some recommendations as far as that goes. Additionally, you can, once again, zombify your dragons and things. If you wanted to do this the dumb way, you can always just put Dragon Scale on basically any of them, and there you go, they will start reflecting damage. They can be zombified like many other things, so yeah, you can just kind of laugh as the AI explodes itself over and over. There's a lot of ways to make that particular situation work, so it's going to be entirely up to you, what you find entertaining, and yeah, if you feel like just manually going through it, typically heavy hitters with a backline of knights to hold control, some poison units, especially long-range poison units. Personally, I prefer to Patriarch for that, but you know, entirely up to you. Patriarchs, ninjas, stuff like that will work just fine, or have your frontline knights with Vile Wound for additional poison on there. Typically, it's going to be a lot more reliable against things like golems and dragons and whatnot, than trying to get the proper counter unit into place. So, for example, a warlock with Golem's Bane will make them hit a little bit harder, whereas just poisoning them and walking away will do the job just fine. And obviously, if you're doing it manually, clerics are going to be quite a bit more useful for you. But for your automatic teams, generally speaking, you want to make them as dumb as possible. So if you want to make that automatic team, if you're not running zombie units, I would recommend just going and taking somebody with really high vitality and switching them over to that cleric. Just high health, high vitality. If you've had somebody training as a knight the entire thing, might as well just switch them into a cleric. It's one of those jobs that really does not need more than good defensive stats to make it work. Pretty much everybody can work to the same effectiveness, more or less. It is worth switching them into something other than their kind of native light element, though, because everything will do more damage to them if they're a light element. Just switch them into something else, they'll have less weaknesses that way. And okay, I think, man, that was a bit of a ramble, but I think that was about it as far as what I want to cover for Chapter 4 type stuff. It's a bit of a wide adventure in that place. Again, just when it comes to all of the excessive amounts of side content, save some of it for the post-game. Trying to 100% Tactics Ogre is like trying to drive yourself insane. It's not really what you want to be doing. It's going to go poorly. You're going to get really frustrated trying to, get some out-there event that somebody said was all, well and fun and needed to be done 100% of the time. Then you'll just end up getting burned out and then start hating the dang thing instead of actually having some fun. There's a lot of different things that a lot of folks will end up clinging to as their favorites, as the thing that you always want to do. But really, what you got to remember is that everyone's experience is going to be different. Everyone's going to like or dislike different stuff. So really just playing and following your own personal experience as to what makes you happy is the best way to build a team and progress. Every time you go through, things are going to be different. It's not a game meant to be 100%ed, and honestly, I don't know why they even added a counter to 100% it, because it is not the way to play this game, even for the long timers. Alright, y'all take a good one. Or take a good one. I don't know why you're taking it. Why did you take the good one? Alright, y'all have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.